So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon to hear more about developmental language disorder. My name is Leslie Orr, and I'm a speech and language therapist working in NHS Lanarkshire. And today it'll be myself and Alison Penny, who's an SLT working in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and also Alison Girvin, who is a student speech and language therapist at Strathclyde University. It'll be the three of us who are presenting this webinar this afternoon. Just a reminder for everybody to turn their microphones off, please, and videos as well, and this just helps when there's such a large audience for bandwidth. The session is being recorded, and all going well with technology, it will be hosted on the Speech and Language Therapy NHS Lanarkshire YouTube channel for people to watch afterwards. So Alison Penny and I are both Scottish Developmental Language Disorder Ambassadors. And what that means is that we are quite passionate about developmental language disorder and very keen to raise awareness of this kind of relatively new condition, newly named condition. And every year since 2018, there has been a Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder Awareness Day in October. Now, it always falls during the Scottish October School Holiday Week, which kind of prevents some of the work that we can do specifically that week or that day. So this year we decided that as part of the awareness raising campaign, we would join together and offer this webinar for education colleagues, just an opportunity to explore this area a bit more. So the format this afternoon is there's a slideshow presentation with a few video clips for us to watch as well. We're going to take you through them. We'll swap over. All three of us are going to be presenting this afternoon, and we will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session. And when we get to that point, we'll be using the chat function. So because there's around 60 people here this afternoon, there's not an opportunity to make it a live discussion. So you can pop questions in the chat bar as we go along, or you can hold them towards the end of the session, and we'll work those questions between us. Okay, so just as a starting point, we're really interested to find out what the audience here already know about developmental language disorder, or how confident you are with this term and what it means, and etc. So we would like you just to take a moment to think about your confidence levels. If 0 was not confident at all and 10 was an expert, where would you place yourself, and could you pop your number in the chat function just now? The chat function will be available to us at the end of the session today, and it means we can take a wee look at the figures after the session. So if people just pop their number in there, so 0 if you are not confident at all about developmental language disorder, DLD we're going to refer to it as, or number 10 if you would rate yourself an expert. So where are you between 0 and 10?
Hi, it's Alison here. So we're getting lots of you putting numbers in the chat, which is great. We don't have any experts so far. I'm not even sure that Leslie and I would put ourselves at a 10, but lots of 3s and 4s and a few 1s as well. So people probably completely new to this term.
Thank you, Alison. And Alison, just to say to you, I can't see the chat function when I'm screen sharing at the moment, fine. So I was grateful for you to step in there. So this presentation is intended to introduce and raise awareness of DLD. It's been written by qualified and experienced speech and language therapists at ICANN. So ICANN is the Children's Communication Charity, and we have used the slides that ICANN have written, but we have also added some additional slides just to sort of personalise it to this particular audience and to make it more relevant for Scotland in particular. Just move on. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to have a focus on what developmental language disorder is, how many children and young people, that's CYP, are affected by DLD. And we're going to think about potential long-term impacts of DLD, what to look out for and how to help. Now, it is a complex area and there are many more resources available online, and we will share follow-up resources at the end. And I should also say at this point that following the webinar, the slides will be emailed out to the participants, so you will be able to review them afterwards and keep a hold of them. So some people will want to know more than what we've covered today, but this will be a good starting point. So a quick quiz to begin with, and this is intended to be fun. So have a wee look at these 5 questions about DLD and either write down your answers on a piece of paper or mentally remember them. You don't need to show this to anyone else. I'll just give you a moment to read through the questions and note your answers. Okay, so we'll come back to this slide at the end, as I mentioned. So moving on, this slide here gives us a simplified picture of the process of communication. And even in a simplified visual, it still looks incredibly complex. And we take this for granted because we do it every day. In reality, the process is not as simplified and as linear as this. But for our purposes, roughly the left-hand side of the diagram shows listening and understanding, and the right hand shows expression or talking. So children and young people with DLD can have a breakdown at many different points on this chain, and often at multiple points. These skills all interact with one another. So a breakdown at one point in the chain will have an impact on many other areas as well. So if we take number 4, for example, being able to understand a sentence. If a child or young person struggles with this, then they're likely to struggle with number 8, which is knowing what's appropriate when responding. So if they've misunderstood or not sure what something means, then it's going to be a struggle for them to know what's appropriate to respond with. And likewise, a child or young person who has difficulty with number 5, which is reading another person's expression and body language, is likely to then be unsure of number 11, choosing what body language and expression to use. So you may have heard some or all of these terms being used to describe children and young people who have difficulties understanding and using language. So things like specific language impairment or SLI, language disorder, language impairment, language difficulties, receptive expressive language disorder, and maybe even language delay, which isn't on the slide there, but I'll come back to that in a minute. It was recognised that there were too many different terms being used to describe these difficulties. So the term developmental language disorder was agreed by consensus amongst professionals across many English-speaking countries, and this took place in 2016. So the main sort of kind of countries involved, there was Australia and America, the UK, but also other English-speaking countries as well, where top professionals got together for an international consensus to think about the different terms that we use to describe children and young people with language needs. And as part of this consensus, the the DLD term became as agreed to be used. So the term specific language impairment, which is in the top left, is now considered out of date and is no longer used, and DLD is used instead. So children previously diagnosed with SLI or specific language impairment now fall into the DLD category. However, the DLD category is actually bigger than just SLI. It encompasses a larger scale of children. And I mentioned language delay as well, and the international sort of agreement was that language delay is no longer favoured, and instead we should be thinking about using language needs or language difficulties until such time that there might be a more appropriate label like DLD. And the main change in terms of SLI no longer being used is to do with verbal and non-verbal discrepancy. So previously, for a child to have a diagnosis of specific language impairment, of SLI, we would be looking for there to be a discrepancy between that child's verbal and non-verbal abilities, but that is no longer relevant for DLD. So the term DLD is used as a diagnostic term by speech and language therapists for children and young people who have language difficulties that, 1, create barriers to communication or learning in everyday life, 2, are unlikely to resolve by age 5. It's a lifelong condition. And 3, that these difficulties are not associated with a known biomedical condition. So children and young people with some biomedical conditions such as autism or Down syndrome may also have a language disorder. But in that case, it would be described as language disorder associated with autism or language disorder associated with Down syndrome. Developmental language disorder means it's not associated with a known biomedical condition. This can be a bit confusing, but if we can think of it like this. The blue circle on the slide represents all children and young people. And within that group, there are some children and young people who have difficulties with their speech, language and communication skills. And this group is shown by the green circle. This includes children and young people who may stammer or have speech sound disorder, or children and young people who are behind with their language because they haven't had enough communication supportive experiences when they were young. Within the green circle of children with speech, language and communication needs, there's a group of children with language disorder, and they are shown by the orange circle. And language disorder means lifelong language difficulties that impact communication or learning in everyday life. These children won't grow out of it, and some of the children in this circle may have a language disorder associated with a known biomedical condition, like autism or Down syndrome. The red circle is DLD, children and young people who have a language disorder that is not associated with another condition. We don't know the causes yet, but this is a lifelong condition that they won't grow out of. So I'm going to pass you over now to Alison Girvin, who's going to take us through the next few slides.
So what is DLD caused by? So we don't know the cause of DLD as yet, but like other developmental conditions such as dyslexia and autism, DLD is caused by a complex interaction between genetic and environmental risk factors, which will vary between individuals. There may be some differences in the brain, but they don't show up on a brain scan. It's often called an invisible or hidden condition because you can't see it. Children and young people can have DLD and dyslexia, or DLD and ADHD. One condition isn't causing or associated with other. The children and young people just have both. Next slide, please. So as we said before, the term DLD is given when children and young people have lifelong language difficulties that are not caused by another medical condition or diagnosis. For example, hearing loss, autism, physical impairment, learning difficulties, or brain injury. We also know it's not caused by environmental reasons or a lack of communication supportive experiences in early childhood. Some children do start school with language difficulties due to a lack of communication supportive experiences, but that's not DLD. Many of those children catch up once they have the right support put in place. It's also not due to poor parenting, and it's important that families know this and don't feel like they've caused their child's difficulties. It's also not caused by emotional difficulties, but lots of children and young people with DLD do have emotional difficulties as well. It's also not caused by learning English as an additional language, which we'll talk a bit more about in the next slide. So DLD and English as an additional language is a complex area. We often see children and young people who seem to be behind in their talking language because they're learning English as a second, third, or fourth language. But this is not a language disorder. It's just the process they are going through of learning another language. But if a child and young people do have DLD, it will affect all of their languages. They'll have difficulties in English, but also in their home language. So if you're concerned about a child and young people with additional languages English, it's a good idea to ask about their skills in their home language as well. Families should keep speaking to their child in their home language. This is the language they're most comfortable in and can give the best language model to their child. So DLD is common. It's been called the most common childhood condition that most people have never heard of. It affects approximately 2 children in every average primary classroom of 30 in the UK. Analysis of data from the Department for Education indicates that more than half of children with DLD are not being identified by schools. Can you all remember what percentage of children you said you thought have DLD in the quiz? So the correct answer is approximately 7.6% of children in primary schools. This is based on a study by Norbury and colleagues in 2016 called the Scales Study. Remember that this is a lifelong condition, so children don't grow out of their difficulties or catch up to their peers once they're in secondary school. DLD is thought to be approximately 7 times more common than autism, yet lots of people haven't heard of it. If you could just put in the chat if anyone you're working with or know have a diagnosis of DLD.
Okay, we've got one person, 2 people have said yes. Someone else has got 1 child. Someone not aware of anyone else yet. No.
Thank you. That's interesting that it's mostly low numbers. So just the next slide, if that's okay. So this slide gives DLD in the context of other types of special educational needs. It's not intended to portray DLD as higher priority than others, but it does demonstrate its prevalence. Approximately 7.6% of children in primary schools in the UK have DLD. Compare these numbers to some of the other types of special education needs, for example, ADHD and ASD. They have a much smaller percentage, but they are much better known.
Thank you, Alison. We now have a few videos that we want to share with you, so if you just bear with me while I bring them up on the screen and hope that the technology doesn't fail. Okay, I'm going to play this, so if any of my colleagues feel there's any errors here in terms of hearing this video, please let me know.
We're here to tell about DLD, Developmental Language Disorder. Let's go, hurry up. Come on, we don't have all day. Today we're going to find out about DLD and explain 3 things what you have to know. DLD 1, 2, 3. We're going to interview some people, but we can't find them anywhere. Ah, found you! And Have you heard of DLD?
Developmental language disorder. It's when you have difficulties talking and understanding words.
Who has DLD?
It affects children and adults.
Has it always been called DLD?
It's been called lots of things like SLI, but now it's been agreed being called DLD.
What's DLD like?
It's just like they're speaking a different language. You're not even like oblivious of what they're saying to you. You just want them to speak English, not those big words, because it's just making it way more harder. You really want to say something and it just stops. Your brain is just gone, is that the word? No, it's not. Is it this one? No, it's not. It's picking out loads of different things. I just want like it to teleport to the other person's head so they know what it means and they get what I'm trying to say to them as quickly as I can.
So there you are, Jules. DLD is when children or adults have problems with talking or understanding. Well, that's really interesting, Eddie. I'm going to try and find out some more. Why do we need to know about DLD?
It's very important that we know about DLD because it's very common, but it's very hidden. And a lot of people don't realize that. It affects about 2 children in every classroom, which is really surprising.
So why does it matter?
It is important because it affects reading, writing, learning, joining in with things, and of course self-esteem. We weren't aware our child had DLD because it was hidden. Even though it's common, it's hidden, and we weren't understanding that he had difficulties at school with his learning, his understanding, which all affected his self-esteem.
So there you go, Eddie. It's really common and it's hidden. It can make lots of things hard, like school and reading. It can be hard joining in and feeling good about yourself. I see, Dylan. Let's see if there's any help. What help is out there?
There's all sorts of help. I was helped by speech language therapists, teachers and other professionals. My parents helped me. In fact, all sorts of people can help you, your colleagues and your friends too.
How can they help?
It really makes a difference if people can understand about DLD. It's hard for me to explain what DLD means, but when people do understand, it makes a big difference.
So, Dylan, there is help. And everybody can help by knowing about DLD. So remember, DLD 1, 2, 3. Please share our film. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so some of you might have children that you're working with, perhaps in your class, or children that you know that that these 2 boys remind you of, or the other girl that was in this video as well. Now that you've watched them and listened to what they've got to say about DLD, you might recognise similarities in some children that you're working with. I'm now going to show you another video which focuses on the sort of older age group.
I was diagnosed with developmental language disorder when I was 15 years old. It's a condition that affects people's abilities in understanding and or using spoken language, and it affects 2 in every classroom of 30. With some people it's obvious as it affects their speech sounds, but for me, my DLD is invisible. This is because my speech sounds are normal, although I can quite often muddle up my words. No one knows what causes it, but it's a neurodevelopmental disorder and is usually genetic, and my sister and dad have it too. It's the most common learning disability that no one has heard of. When I found out, I was angry because teachers had told me off my whole life for not paying attention. I always found it so hard to understand words and instructions. The other kids never seemed to struggle to form a sentence and to express themselves the way that I do. I always knew I was different, and I finally know why. When people talk to me, it feels like the words are like nerve bullets, and instead of going into your brain, they just bounce off. It feels like you have to catch the words as they're spoken, but they're falling so fast you can't catch them all and you're missing out on what's been said. Sometimes I'll zone out and it's like my head is full of clouds and I'll click back into place and I don't know what's been going on. People think that once I find a way to help my developmental language disorder, it will go away, but that's not the case. It's not like a broken leg or a cold, so I'm stuck with it forever. And that's okay. My dad said it feels like a gift. It changes the way we see the world.
Okay, so again, this girl in this video may remind you of young people that you are working with. So I'm going to pass things over to Alison Penny now. I'll just bring the slides back up for you, Alison.
Thanks, Leslie. Okay, so we've heard from Leslie and Alison some of the facts about DLD. What I'm going to do now is to look at what a child might present like who perhaps has DLD, and then move on to what you can do about it as an educator. So developmental language disorder, it's obviously all about language, and language underlies absolutely everything that we do. I wonder if we just use the chat function for you to think about what you've used language for today. What have you used your language skills for? Okay, so to help children learn new things, yep. Pumpkin carving discussions, sounds great. Speaking to colleagues, giving instructions. Interviewing, hope you got a good person. Communicating with others. Okay, lots and lots of answers there, even leading PE lessons, supporting your peers. So we use language for lots and lots of things, from telling others in your house to get up because it's time to get ready and go to school or work, from understanding the traffic report and knowing where the flooding is so that you'll get into your school or office okay, to giving instructions to your class, and to sharing jokes with friends. So as this slide shows, language underlies everything we do, reading and writing, understanding what we read, learning new concepts and vocabulary, understanding explanations that people give us, following instructions, even resolving conflicts in the playground, following rules for a sport or a game, and negotiating with peers. So these are skills that children and young people will use throughout their whole school day. And for children where they may have DLD, you might see some difficulties in these areas. Children always falling out with friends and not able to resolve simple conflicts. Children looking a bit lost when you teach them something new. Maybe they end up copying a peer to see what they've to do, or they come and ask you if you could explain it again. Maybe when you give them instructions, they follow one of the instructions, but not all of them, and they look confused. Okay, next slide, please. There's also a wider impact. It's not just about children not understanding the language or not being able to express themselves. If a child does have DLD and has difficulties with understanding and or expressing themselves, this is likely to have a much wider impact on their life. So it can impact in friendships, for children to keep up with conversations that their peers are having, or for them to understand the rules of games that peers are making up. They might not be able to follow up with that, and that can make friendships difficult. For their behaviour, they might be the child in the class who hangs back, doesn't offer much in class, looks as if they're not listening a lot of the time. Or they might be the child who plays up, finds it too hard to listen because they're not understanding the words, so they're disruptive. Obviously, their academic attainment across the board can be impacted, so not just language skills, but also things like maths. If we think about all of the language concepts that are in the maths curriculum, from adding, subtracting to things like more than, less than, wider than. So lots of language needs to be understood in order to understand those subjects, and even as children get older and are doing subjects like science, there's a lot of very difficult vocabulary. So if you have a difficulty with learning new vocabulary and storing vocabulary and being able to retrieve vocabulary, those subjects might be particularly difficult. You also might see that a child has difficulty with organising themselves, so not having the right things in front of them to do an activity. But also, we know that having developmental language disorder can have an impact on children's mental health and social and emotional well-being. One of the questions that you were asked at the beginning in the quiz was what percentage of children and young people with emotional and behavioural difficulties have been found to have significant and often unidentified language difficulties. That percentage is 81%. So it's absolutely huge, and it really signifies the long-term and wider impact that difficulties such a disorder such as developmental language disorder can have. However, what we have to remember, it's not all doom and gloom. If these difficulties are identified early in a child's life, those working with the child and the child or young person themselves can begin to understand what their difficulties are and how to support them. Next slide, please. So the child in your class who may have DLD may have difficulties with attention and listening, behaviour, social interaction and friendships, talking, understanding and academic work. It's your job as an educator to look out for possible signs of developmental language disorder and to put some supports in place, but it's not your job to diagnose. You'll be glad to hear that. A speech and language therapist is the only professional who can diagnose the lifelong condition of developmental language disorder. And it's really important that children do get diagnoses, and that when a report is given, that the therapist is writing on the report that this is a lifelong condition, so that the young person themselves and families and future teachers of that young person will understand how to support them. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a fantastic slide. This image has just come out by the Raising Awareness campaign for DLD, RADLD this year, and we're quite excited by it in speech and language therapy. It really is a lovely visual of the difficulties that a child with DLD may have. So we can see that there might be difficulties in speech sounds, but we also know that from the videos we've seen that not every child with DLD has any speech difficulties. Okay, so it's important to know that that might just be one little area, but they may not have any speech difficulties at all. They may have difficulties with learning and memory, so remembering what words to say, or difficulty following directions, trouble learning a pattern. They might have difficulty with social language, so knowing how to communicate in different situations. They might have difficulties having conversations with people, which can lead to difficulties with socialising with others. They might have difficulties with discourse, so that is kind of telling a story, putting events in the wrong order so that it sounds out of sequence. And it might be really difficult to understand what the child is trying to tell you. So a few children that I've worked with recently, the teachers have said when they come in from the playground and the child is upset and trying to tell the teacher what has happened, what has gone wrong in the playground, it's very difficult to follow because the child is not able to put it in the right order or misses out some important points. Use of sentences, so they might miss out some key words or miss out parts of words, so the grammatical structure might not be that as expected of a child their age, which can make it more difficult to follow because they might be using the wrong verb tense, so you're not quite sure if the situation has happened or it's in the future. Words, this is often an area that is evident for children with developmental language disorder. So they may have trouble recalling words, have word finding difficulties. Now, I don't know about you, but as I get older, I certainly have difficulties retrieving the right word that I want to use. But for children with DLD, they may have that difficulty with everyday words. Okay, and they might find it more difficult to learn new vocabulary and have a smaller vocabulary overall. So this is a really nice visual, and as we say, you will get the slides, so you'll be able to use this to think about some of the children in your class. Next slide, please. So ICANN asked some preschool and primary age education staff about what these children might look like in their class. So this is just quite an interesting word diagram. So some children were described as being disruptive, daydreaming, difficult to understand, words jumbled up, they seem frustrated or withdrawn, have emotional outbursts, disengaged, don't really get the big picture. They are using shorter sentences. They've got poor grammar. So I'm sure some of these things are setting off triggers in your mind of some children that you work with. Now, these difficulties might be DLD, but they could be other things. So it's just thinking about, is it the language that's causing the difficulty with the children, or is there something else going on? Okay, next slide, please. So probably what you're all itching to get to, how do you help these children? The good news is there's lots of things you can do to help as class teachers, nursery workers, secondary teachers, and I know we've got a wide range of people today. Please don't wait for a speech and language therapist to give a diagnosis before you put any help in place. There are lots of strategies that you can trial, which I'll go through just now. And actually, a lot of these strategies you're probably using already for other types of children. So maybe children who have a diagnosis of autism, or children who have learning needs, or children who have dyslexia. You may be putting some of these strategies in place. So they shouldn't be anything too time consuming or too difficult to put in place in your classroom, but the good news is that recognising that a child may need some of these strategies can really give them some help. Next slide, please. So the the first strategy is about a communication supportive environment. So just thinking about your classroom, your play area, your school, and how the child who possibly has DLD is going to learn. Reducing background noise. I know that this is really difficult to do, and having been in schools over the past year during the pandemic where windows are open, doors are open, places seem to be a lot noisier. But I think it's just recognising that for a child who finds it difficult to understand when you're talking to them, having extra background noise will just make it even more difficult for them. So when there are particular points where the child needs to get information and understand, try to reduce that background noise. Planning and using visual supports. So there's all sorts of fantastic visual supports, from pictures and photographs to symbols like Boardmaker, or using mind maps and diagrams can really help children with language disorder to understand. The reason that pictures and symbols are helpful is that as soon as we say a word, it just disappears. It's gone as soon as it's left our mouth. Whereas a picture stays there. And so a child, while they may not have understood the words, or they may have forgotten what you've said, they can refer to the picture. It's there, it's a constant, and it may help them to understand and to remember. So visually labelling your classroom resources, and as a whole school, nursery or secondary, having the same labels would be helpful for those types of children. If the child is at the written stage, then writing down key information and instructions can be helpful too, and highlighting, underlining or putting words in bold, the key words that they really have to understand to know what to do. Using a visual timetable can really help children with developmental language disorder organise their day, know what's coming next, help them know how much time they have to do something. So making use of a visual timetable and referring to that timetable throughout the day can be very helpful. Reducing classroom clutter. When somewhere's too busy, when there's too much on the walls, it can be hard to see what the important information is. So just to have a look around your area and think about, do the important pieces of information really stand out? So an example of this was, I was in a school just this morning and went into a class, well, approached the class door, and the classroom door was full of loads of pictures, and I couldn't find a sign on it that said the teacher's name. And me being me, in and out lots of schools, I'd forgotten the class teacher's name, so it just wasn't particularly helpful. So just thinking about what's the helpful information. Yes, it's great to display children's work, and that's really important, but also to make sure that the important information stands out. And also encouraging asking for help. So having an environment that's really supportive, and that children and young people are quite happy to come and ask for help. I've seen some teachers use fantastic strategies for this, because actually putting your hand up or approaching a class teacher to ask for help in itself can be difficult. So some teachers maybe put in a visual system where they turn over a card and it's red on one side, and the teacher can just look around and notice, oh, that pupil is needing some help with something because they see the colour red. Okay, next slide, please. For children with developmental language disorder, another thing that you can really do to help is to adapt your own language. Okay, so just thinking about the words that you say, how you teach, how you give instructions in order to help support that child understand or express themselves. So very simply saying their name first to get their attention, so that they know that this instruction is important for them to listen to. Giving instructions that are simple and using familiar vocabulary. And also just using short and simple sentences. If you know a child is struggling to understand the language, don't give too much information at a time. Also, just to slow down and pause often in order to give the child extra thinking time. Now, we appreciate this can't be done at all points of the school day where things are rushed and you've got lots to get through. But if you feel that a child is struggling to understand and not keep up with the pace, just slowing down a little and giving shorter instructions may be enough to support them. Repeating any key points and summarising at the end. But also really helpful, along with the language and the words that you use. As we said before, use visuals, write, draw and demonstrate. Use visuals that are pictures or drawings on the board or natural gesture. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, words and vocabulary can be a particular area of difficulty for children with developmental language disorder. So it's really helpful to explicitly teach vocabulary. Now this is true for all ages and stages. So if you're in the nursery class, don't assume that children will have simple vocabulary like house, sink, tap. And if you're at school age and secondary school age, again, don't assume that children will know vocabulary. They may have to be explicitly taught some words that other children have just picked up. Children need to hear the same words again and again, and it's certainly true for children who have DLD that they need to hear words more often, more times in order to try and store those words correctly and be able to retrieve them. Giving concrete examples of what the new vocabulary is always helpful, and creating opportunities for children to practice new words. Again, using visual prompts and supports can help children to recall those words. It's not hugely important that the child is able to retrieve every word. What is really important is that if they can't retrieve a word, they are able to describe it. And that's where if you're giving them lots of examples about what the new word is, what it means in different contexts, how they could use that word, even what sound it begins with, how many syllables are in it, other words that mean the same thing. By teaching them all of that about vocabulary, that child is more likely to go on and be able to remember some of those bits of information about those words and therefore be able to describe what they're meaning, even if they can't quite retrieve the right word. Okay, next slide, please. So that has been a whistle-stop tour of some strategies that hopefully you can put in place within your class, or hopefully you're saying to yourself, that's great, I'm already doing that, and you'll know that you're on your way to be supporting some children who potentially have DLD. Just looking at the quiz again before we have some Q&A, and we'll just go through the right answers. So around 7.6% of children in the UK have DLD. It is more prevalent than autism. As we said, around 81% of children and young people who have emotional and behavioural disorders have been found to have significant but often unidentified language difficulties. So all of the above are possible indicators of DLD, so that's difficulty understanding language, difficulty talking, difficulty with talking and understanding, and difficulty with literacy, reading comprehension and spoken language. And who can diagnose a DLD? It's a speech and language therapist, but with a lot of help from teachers, from educators, being able to give us information about how the child is progressing in school and presenting within the class. Okay, so we're finished with our slides and we're going to move on to see if anyone has any questions. This is just some of the associations and other places that you can get additional resources from. So if anyone has a question they want to ask us or a comment they want to make, do you want to put it into the chat function? Okay, so we've got one right away. So can a child with DLD be different communicating in the family home than being at nursery? The child speaks lots at home and within the nursery is quite quiet, uses one word to communicate and copies children in their play rather than playing with other children. Leslie, do you want to take that question?
Okay, I would say that this is, you can agree, Alison, hopefully with me, it would be unusual for a DLD profile if the child is demonstrating kind of fluent communication at home and managing to, you know, build sentences, get their message across, there's not an impact in the home environment, then it's unlikely that DLD is the reason that they're presenting differently in nursery. So we'd be looking at something wider.
I would agree with that, and that's why we often, as part of our assessment, would look at parent-child interaction. So we would watch a child interacting with their parent to get an idea of, is their communication and language skills good with their family, in which case we feel that it's not a specific difficulty with language. Okay.
The next question is about, is the condition more prevalent in boys or girls? I suspect, Alison, that it's more boys are identified because we know that with language difficulties in general. So that would be my sort of answer to that one, more in boys, but they're...
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't have exact figures, but we do know that there's a higher percentage of language communication difficulties in boys. Okay, then we've got
someone that works in a nursery, possible child with DLD, child's very distressed, screams often. Do we ignore this screaming? I think, you know, for a child, you would be trying to work out what the reason for the screaming is, if possible. You know, any behaviour could be a communication attempt. So, you know, trying to look for patterns of what's distressing the child. Is it, you know, the environment? Is there something in the environment you're able to sort of adjust? It's, you know, difficult from that description, obviously, to see whether this could be DLD or not, but it's, you know, it could be that there's a, you know, real difficulty communicating and the child is using other methods to get their message across.
Okay, is that an interesting question? Would this generally be diagnosed before a young person starts at secondary school? Unfortunately not. So from the information we've given you today, you've probably seen that there's an underdiagnosis of children. So the difficulties are quite often hidden, not recognised, and the child may not have been put forward for an assessment. Generally, the diagnosis, we wouldn't give a diagnosis until they're sort of 5 or over, because we want to make sure that we're clear that it's a long-term difficulty that they have. We would hope that with our awareness raising, that more children will be identified in primary school at that age. However, if you have a child in secondary school who you think has possibly has a DLD, please discuss with your local speech and language therapy department.
Okay, so can DLD be diagnosed alongside autism? I have a child and he's diagnosed with autism PDA, and I feel through this presentation he would fall under DLD. So if the child has a diagnosis of autism, they can still have a language disorder as part of the autism, and you know, you may well see the language disorder kind of signs and what we've talked about today, but the diagnosis would be language disorder associated with autism. So they can't have a dual diagnosis of developmental language disorder and autism. It would just be language disorder associated with autism, but the profile of language needs would be potentially similar to what we've discussed today.
Okay, any other questions before we finish off? Okay, we just want to ask again, we asked at the beginning what your confidence was and knowledge around developmental language disorder. So we'd just like to ask that question again. So on a scale of 0 to 10, could you pop in the chat function what your knowledge is now, or your confidence of DLD?
So we've certainly got some higher figures at this end of the session, which is encouraging. Some 6s, 7s and 8s coming through. We did say at the start of today's session that this is an awareness raising session, and some people will need and want to know more about DLD. So the slide at the end signposts to other organisations. It may be that you want to do a wee bit of your own research following the webinar. ICANN in particular have this year released a very detailed document for education staff, and there's a summary document as well. So there's a 2-page summary, and then I think it's a 30 odd page document all about DLD and education. So that's one to signpost due to in particular.
Okay.
The recording seems to have worked as far as I know. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to host it on the NHS Lanarkshire Speech and Language Therapy YouTube page, and we will advertise that across social media. But please spread the word with colleagues that this recording will be available. I know there were lots of people weren't able to come along today because we were full within a few days of advertising, so it would be great for people to have the opportunity to watch the recording.
And just also to give a little plug for NHS Lanarkshire Twitter page, and also Greater Glasgow and Clyde, so it's South Glasgow Speech and Language Therapy Department. Leslie and I actually, as well as being DLD ambassadors, we also run the Twitter pages for our organisations. So it'd be really nice if you could follow us. We often put information on there about DLD and strategies.
Okay, there's just a final comment come in here, Alison, about someone who's concerned that they didn't really know anything before about DLD, and especially in the role that they're in. You're here today, and it's great you went from a 0 to a 5 or a 6. That's amazing. It's just about building on that knowledge now and moving forward. So thank you.
Someone's asked about a long waiting list for referrals. Waiting times are different throughout Scotland, so we couldn't really answer that. What we'd suggest is that speech and language therapy tend to have an open referral system, or you're able to consult with a speech and language therapist. So find out who is your local department and get in touch with them and ask to have a conversation with them to start off with.
Okay, so we're just reaching nearly 4:30. I've timed that well. Twitter account name.
Okay, so I'll just pop them in here.
Is it on the slide, Alison?
It's on the last slide. Yeah,
I'll pull the slides back up, and then people can perhaps write it down if they do. There we go.
Thanks. It's such a strange way to do training because you're not really getting feedback from people, so it's nice if people have put comments in the chat function.
Okay, NHS Lanarkshire also have a Facebook page as well, Speech and Language Therapy NHS Lanarkshire.
Great, thanks very much everyone. Have a happy Halloween.